Hey there, and welcome to a twilight stroll through one of the most unpredictable corners of history, ancient Egypt's recreational chemistry and their party scene that, honestly, puts modern spring break to shame. Tonight, you're not just a spectator. You're an honorary guest at a Nile-side festival, slipping past the guards with me, your undercover time-traveling party reporter, as we chase after a story that starts with a sacred flower and ends with a hangover worthy of a goddess. There's a wild twist coming up that's so outrageous you'll want to stick around till the very end. But before we sneak into the past, if you genuinely love sleep stories that mix history with a wink and a nudge, give this a like and hit subscribe. And seriously, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Nothing beats the feeling of a global crew sharing a midnight tale together. So, dim those lights, cozy up, maybe cue up some faint Nile River sounds in the background, and let's slip into a calm, dreamy journey where ancient Egypt's party secrets are about to be revealed. All right, so picture this. You're at a lavish Egyptian banquet, golden lamps flickering, the scent of roasted duck in the air, and everyone is passing around what looks like a bouquet, but is actually a ticket to the cosmos. This, my friends, is the famous blue lotus flower. Forget your basic table centerpiece. This blossom is the original influencer. If you ever scrolled past a tomb painting and thought, why is that pharaoh always sniffing a flower? Well, now you know. The blue lotus wasn't just for looks. This petal-packed superstar was ancient Egypt's answer to the question, how do we make these hymns less shrill? Here's how it worked. You take the blue lotus petals, let them soak in wine for days, sometimes long enough to make even the gods impatient. And then, at the next festival or temple bash, you'd break out the infusion. One sip, and suddenly your worries about pyramid taxes or your neighbor's pet baboon just melted away. The feeling wasn't a full-on trip. You wouldn't forget who you were or try to repaint the Sphinx. But there was a gentle euphoria, a dreamy softness that made even the most tedious rituals feel like a group hug. It was as if the entire court had discovered the joys of floating on a cloud of papyrus reeds, with nothing but the stars and a mild floral buzz to keep you company. But let's be clear, the Egyptians would never have called this getting high. No, they had a much more mystical spin. To them, blue lotus was the hotline to the divine. It symbolized rebirth and was strongly connected to Ra, the sun god. Holding a lotus up to your nose, that was like inhaling a piece of the sun, or at least a whiff of cosmic approval. It's no wonder that the flower shows up everywhere, in the hands of pharaohs, tucked behind the ears of party guests, and even lovingly arranged on the chests of mummies. If you believed you'd need some spiritual snacks for the afterlife, the blue lotus was high on the packing list. And the festivals, oh the festivals! The lotus wine was less about quiet reflection and more about making sure the servers had enough jugs to go around. Imagine a courtyard under the endless Egyptian sky, music echoing off sandstone walls, and every guest passing around a clay cup of wine that's been steeping in lotus petals since the last full moon. The dancing got wilder, the singing got louder, and the poetry, well, let's just say the less said about those drunken hieroglyphic limericks, the better. Now, if you think modern party culture is wild, let me introduce you to the ancient Egyptian feast of drunkenness. Yes, that's its real name. Subtlety was clearly not the goal. This annual event was basically the original drink until you see God festival. Except in this case, you just might actually see the goddess Hathor herself, or at least her tipsy look-alike across the courtyard. The story behind this bash is a blockbuster in itself. According to myth, the goddess Hathor was sent down to punish humanity for, well, being a mess. She did her job a little too enthusiastically, and soon the gods realized things were getting out of hand. Their solution? Trick her into drinking a beer dyed red to look like blood. Hathor, thoroughly hammered, passed out cold and woke up in a much better mood. Mass extinction averted by a round of drinks, ancient crisis management at its finest. So, every year, the Egyptians commemorated this near apocalypse with a party that would make even your wildest college roommate look prudent. The goal? Drink until you entered a trance. Not a metaphorical trance, not a moment of quiet meditation. No, the kind of trance where you wake up face down in a dusty courtyard, clutching a tambourine, and everyone around you is singing praises between hiccups. The event started at dawn. Priests banged drums and handed out drinks with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winnings. "Drink as much as your heart desires," they proclaim, which in this context is less spiritual advice and more a direct challenge. Tambourines shook, dancers whirled, and at some point, the line between sacred vision and double vision got thoroughly blurred. Some guests claimed to spot the goddess herself. But let's be honest, after your 5th round of Lotus wine, the clay water jug starts looking divine. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just sanctioned chaos. There was a method to the madness. The festival was meant to celebrate the delicate balance between destruction and joy. It was a reminder that, sometimes, even the angriest deities can be swayed by a strong enough cocktail. This was theology meets the world's rowdiest keg stand, and if you didn't pass out from spiritual elevation, people started to wonder if you were even trying. Why so sober, Neshi? Do you not respect the gods, or are you just bad at parties? Ancient peer pressure was real. Scholars today call this a ritual of renewal. For the Egyptians, it was a way to purge your fears, your inhibitions, and, with any luck, the contents of your stomach. The next morning brought headaches, regret, and sometimes a mysterious new bruise in the shape of a jackal, but also a sense of spiritual cleansing. Forget juice cleanses. This was the ancient version of detox, and it came with live music. Now, let's talk about what everyone at these parties was actually drinking. Prepare yourself, because if you're imagining a crisp, cold pint of beer, you're about to be sorely disappointed. Egyptian beer was not the golden, bubbly brew you'd find at the corner pub. It was thick, porridge-like, and so chunky you might need a spoon. Picture a drink that confuses both your bartender and your dentist. This was less a beverage, more a meal you could technically pour. Beer in Egypt was made from loaves of emmer bread, yes, actual bread, partially baked, then crumbled into water, mashed up, and left to ferment. The result? A lumpy beige concoction lovingly referred to as liquid bread. It looked like soupy oatmeal and tasted like, well, survival. But in a world where the Nile could turn deadly and the local water supply was basically a dare, this beer was safer than most alternatives. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and came served in communal jugs, because nothing says unity like 5 people slurping from a pot of alcoholic bread soup. And here's the kicker: this beer was for everyone. Pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. If you could hold a cup, you were in the club. It was a staple, a ritual, and a paycheck all in one. Pyramid builders got paid in beer, sometimes several liters a day. Imagine hauling limestone blocks in the desert sun, just slightly buzzed and full of carbs. The next time your boss complains about productivity, remind them that the pyramids were built by people who were basically on a liquid bread diet and still managed to invent geometry. But beer wasn't just a bland, utilitarian sludge. It got an upgrade for festivals and ceremonies. Enter the mystery additives: herbs, dates, honey, and occasionally whatever happened to be growing in the priest's backyard. Sometimes mandrake found its way into the brew, which could take your experience from pleasantly floaty to, did I just see a crocodile wearing eyeliner? Historians still debate whether this was a calculated attempt at mind expansion or just the result of a particularly adventurous chef. Let's be honest, though. The taste was a crime against taste buds. Archaeologists like to call it rustic, but that's just a polite way of saying, why is this lumpy? Yet, for the Egyptians, this was more than enough. Water was a gamble, milk was suspicious, but beer was reliable, filling, and only occasionally tried to choke you with bread chunks. For special occasions, it might be spiced up with something sacred, or, let's be real, something experimental. If you're tired of reality, just add mandrake and see what happens. This communal drinking wasn't just for the sake of merriment. It was a spiritual act, a way to connect with the gods and with each other. It wasn't about forgetting life's problems, but about transforming them together in a haze of music and mildly alcoholic porridge. And if you woke up the next day with a headache and a vague memory of dancing with a priest, that was just part of the ritual. Of course, the logistics of all this are hilarious from a modern perspective. No foam, no carbonation, no elegant glassware, just coarse ceramic jugs, straws with built-in filters to catch the larger bread bits, and a national agreement to ignore the concept of mouthfeel. Forget the IPA tasting notes. Here, the only notes were chewy, with hints of desperation and survival. In the end, the Egyptian approach to festive drinking was less about escaping reality and more about leaning into it, together, bread chunks and all. They used their botanical tricks, their questionable brewing methods, and their unstoppable party spirit to blur the lines between ritual, pleasure, and daily grind. And somehow, between the Lotus wine, the bread beer, and the wildest goddess hangover in history, they built a civilization that still fascinates us today. Now, with your belly full of imaginary bread beer and your mind just a little bit lighter, let's wander deeper into the Egyptian night. Because what's a party without a little ambience? Next up, sacred smoke, potent plants, and the apothecary of the gods. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. Let that blue lotus haze swirl through your third eye as we really set the vibe. Forget mood lighting. Here in Egypt, we're talking about sacred smoke, and not just any old incense stick from your local market stall. We're diving nose first into Kaifi, the rock star of temple fragrances, the mother of all mystical potpourri. If you've ever wondered what a bakery run by a wizard smells like, this is it. Kaifi is not your standard issue frankincense. No, this stuff is a fever dream of an apothecary who moonlights as a pastry chef. Imagine a massive cauldron where honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever else the priests had lying around that wasn't already promised to the gods gets tossed in. Stir it all together, let it bubble and ferment, then dry it into neat little pellets. Once you burn it, you get a room so fragrant you can't tell if you're in a holy sanctuary or the world's most confusing dessert shop. Each temple had its own secret recipe, the ancient world's answer to the modern signature scent. Sometimes, the instructions ran for pages, with lists of 16 or more ingredients and directions that made IKEA manuals look like a game of tic-tac-toe. Want to impress your fellow priests? Better add that pinch of obscure spice under the next crescent moon. Honestly, it's a wonder anyone remembered the prayers after all that. But the real magic happens when Kaifi hits the coals. Picture this, a limestone chamber, no windows, no breeze, just a thick cloud of sweet, spicy smoke curling around you and the sweating priest beside you. He's waving a dish of smouldering incense with one arm, chanting in a voice that sounds like a pharaoh's, Alexa stuck on monotone. The air gets thick, your eyes water, and suddenly you can't remember if you're having a vision or just losing oxygen. Either way, you're convinced the gods are in the room, or maybe you just really need to sit down. Kaifi was the original multitasker. It purified the soul, masked the scent of last night's questionable fish stew, and, according to Pliny the Elder, cured everything from snake bites to insomnia. And let's be honest, if you inhaled enough of it, you might just pass out right there, sleeping soundly on a cold temple floor. Sleep Stories, Ancient Egyptian Edition. Tonight's tale is brought to you by the sweet, soporific haze of fermented Kaifi. Rest well, or at least forget your regrets. Even in death, Kaifi stuck around. It was burned during mummification, mixed into the wrappings, and sprinkled in tombs. Somewhere out there's a pharaoh who got embalmed with enough cinnamon and honey to pass for a Christmas ham. The ancient Egyptians were clear on this point. If you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. Let's do a quick roll call of Egypt's psychoactive celebrity guests. If Blue Lotus is the chill friend who brings good vibes, and Kaifi is the drama queen who insists on a fob machine at every gathering, then Mandrake is the unhinged wild card you invite once and immediately regret. Mandrake doesn't just show up. It arrives with roots shaped like tiny screaming humans and a reputation for wild side effects that make even seasoned priests nervous. Mandrake, or as the Egyptians called it, that root you only touch if you're desperate or very brave, was both a medicine and a supernatural dare. It was famous for its powers as a painkiller and, possibly, an aphrodisiac. Because nothing says romance like, "Here, drink this mysterious root extract and let's see what happens." It shows up in ancient medical scrolls, like the Ebers papyrus, as a remedy for everything from sleeplessness to fertility woes. But let's not kid ourselves. This was not a casual home remedy. Mandrake's secret weapon is a bunch of alkaloids with names that sound like villains from a Marvel movie: scopolamine, atropine, hyoscyamine. In tiny doses, you might drift off into a peaceful sleep. In slightly bigger ones, get ready for a hallucination or two featuring Ra, the sun god, arm wrestling a crocodile in drag. And if you really overdo it, you'll wake up convinced you've been reincarnated as a dung beetle, rolling your bed across the living room. Harvesting mandrake was a whole ritual in itself. Later legends claimed that pulling it from the ground would unleash a deadly scream, which is why the solution was to tie the root to a loyal dog, cover your ears, and let the poor animal do the dirty work. There's no solid proof. The Egyptians actually made their pets participate in this botanical horror show. But the story fits right in with mandrake's reputation as a plant you don't mess with lightly. In temple rituals, mandrake was reserved for priests, magicians, and anyone who didn't mind a little existential roulette. Used carefully, it could ease pain, help with sleep, or even add a little spice to a romantic evening. Used recklessly, it was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a bad trip at Burning Man. 1 minute you're composing poetry to Hathor, the next you're convinced the walls are melting. But mandrake wasn't the only plant with a cult following. Nestled among the dried lizards and mysterious ointments of the temple pharmacy was a quieter but equally controversial guest, cannabis. That's right, the Egyptians had their own stash, and they called it shemshemet. When it came to treating pain, inflammation, or just the general trauma of living with sand in your sandals, sometimes you need more than holy water. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebbers and Ramesseum papyri, mostly as a remedy for inflammation, sore eyes, and, yes, gynecological complaints. If you think modern wellness influencers are creative, just wait until you hear about ancient Egyptian THC-infused suppositories. That's a wellness trend you know someone's going to try to bring back on Etsy. But the Egyptians didn't roll joints or host pyramid hotbox parties. Most of the time, cannabis was mixed into oils, blended with honey, or applied as a soothing balm. Topical use was the go-to. But let's be real, with all that incense wafting through the temples, there's a fair chance some priests were getting an unplanned contact high. Officially, cannabis was medicinal. Unofficially, after a day spent chanting in a smoky, sweltering temple, nobody was policing how relaxed the priests got. If the high priest started giving the statues pep talks, who's to say that wasn't what the gods wanted? Modern science backs up the ancient love affair. Analyses of mummy wrappings and burial sites have turned up traces of cannabis, opium, and even nicotine. Either the Egyptians were running the world's most suspicious health spa, or they believed in sending their dearly departed off with the best party favors money could buy. And let's not forget the priests, those multitasking spiritual influencers who double as both pharmacists and DJs for the afterlife. These guys could chant, interpret dreams, and stare into clouds of incense until the walls started talking back. If cannabis was part of their toolkit, it wasn't just for fun. It was to open the mind, ease the body, and maybe, just maybe, make the chorus of chanting a little less repetitive. Now, stashed just behind the temple's row of holy ointments and next to the basket of dried crocodile feet, you'd find the real star of the ancient world's medicine cabinet, opium. Imported poppy pods, wrinkled and mysterious, straight from the Mediterranean, tucked away like a priest's secret stash. Because, When you've got plagues, back pain from pyramid building, and the occasional existential crisis, sometimes prayer needs a little pharmaceutical backup. Opium wasn't native to Egypt, but once it arrived, it was an instant cult classic. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppy juice had become the go-to fix for pain, sleeplessness, and anything that made daily life less tolerable. The Egyptians were early adopters, and boy, did they get creative. Opium soothed pain, calmed coughs, made childbirth slightly less terrifying, and, if you listened to the temple chants long enough, probably made you believe in cosmic balance. You could drink it, swallow it as a pill, or, because ancient medical innovation knows no shame, take it as a suppository. The priests would hand it over with a solemn nod and some mystical advice. This will align your spleen with the stars. In the temple pharmacy, opium was both medicine and mystery, the ancient equivalent of a Xanax prescription and a fortune cookie rolled into one. The texts never say opium outright, of course. That would be too straightforward. Instead, they talk about extract of poppy, in the same vague language that modern food labels use for natural flavors. If you were an elite Egyptian, you might even take some opium with you to the afterlife, just in case the journey got a little too real. Let's be honest, the line between sacred and recreational was blurrier than the Nile at flood season. For the Egyptians, these substances were a ticket to spiritual elevation, pain relief, or just a really, really good nap. Used wisely, kaifi, mandrake, cannabis, and opium could ease suffering and inspire visions. Used carelessly, they turned temple assistants into the ancient world's answer to spaced-out backup dancers. In a land of tooth drills, sandstorms, and unpredictable gods, who could blame them for wanting a little herbal insurance? So, as the last wisps of kaifi drift through the temple and the priests finish their rituals with glassy eyes and serene smiles, we're left with a culture that blurred the line between pharmacy, perfumery, and holy mystery. These ancient Egyptians didn't just seek transcendence, they engineered it, one potent plant at a time. But as any good party reporter knows, the real action often starts after the smoke clears. And in Egypt, where sophistication met the sacred, nothing signaled status quite like a cup of wine. If you ever thought wine was just a casual after-work drink, ancient Egypt would like a word. Here, wine wasn't just for sipping on a balcony while watching the sunset over the Nile. It was a full-on, multi-sensory experience, a liquid passport to the divine, a social statement, and occasionally a fast track to forgetting your own name. Picture this: priests gliding through temple halls, balancing hefty amphorae filled with what looks like wine, but tastes suspiciously, like a botanical experiment gone rogue. The air is thick with incense and anticipation, and everyone's eyeing the punch bowl, knowing full well that tonight things might get weird. Wine was the drink of Osiris, the toast of the gods, and, let's be honest, the original Egyptian party starter. But before you imagine delicate sips and wine snobs swirling goblets and muttering about notes of limestone, let's set the record straight. Egyptian wine could knock you sideways. This wasn't your average fermented grape juice. These brews were infused with everything from blue lotus and mandrake to myrrh and frankincense, ingredients that sound like the inventory list for a perfume counter, but were definitely meant to do more than just smell nice. The ancient Egyptians didn't just drink wine, they engineered it for maximum effect. Sometimes it was medicinal, sort of. Got a headache? Here's some Lotus wine. Sore joints? Try this red, aged with frankincense. Existential dread? Well, that called for priestly supervision and maybe a mat to catch you when you passed out. There's something deeply reassuring about knowing that even the ancients believed in self-medicating with whatever was on hand, as long as it came with a side of ritual. Religious festivals were ground zero for this high-octane beverage. Take the Feast of Drunkenness, a name that really says it all. This wasn't a cozy wine-tasting session. This was about chugging sacred brews until the room spun, the gods descended, and you found yourself slow dancing with a priest in leopard skins. In theory, it was spiritual ecstasy. In practice, it was probably a lot closer to a Vegas bachelor party with better costumes and more incense. And it wasn't only the living who got in on the action. No, the Egyptians made sure their gods were well lubricated too. Vats of fortified wine weren't just consumed, they were offered up in temples, poured out onto altars, or stacked inside tombs as care packages for the afterlife. Some of these offerings were so potent, you half expect the statue to get up and start dancing. If you woke up in a lotus garden with no memory of how you got there, it wasn't a hangover. It was considered a divine visitation. That's the kind of plausible deniability you just can't get at a modern brunch. This blending of sacred and recreational was totally normal in Egypt. Everything was a ritual, and rituals were the perfect excuse for a little chemical creativity. If you saw a priestess convulsing in the temple, no one panicked. She wasn't rushed out for medical attention. She was cheered on. Look, Hathor's arrived, and she's got opinions about the tambourine tempo. Divine possession was less of a crisis and more of a performance review. The more dramatic the trance, the better the party. How did they get there, you ask? A classic recipe, endless drumming, hypnotic chanting, a haze of burning kifi, a night without sleep, and, of course, a goblet of wine with mysterious petals floating in it. Before long, someone was gasping out prophecies, announcing cryptic advice, or just taking an unscheduled nap on the temple floor. If you've ever seen someone get a little too into karaoke at a wedding, you've got the general idea. Priests and priestesses were basically the original party hosts, except their guest list included gods, ancestors, and anyone enthusiastic enough to join. They trained for this, practicing how to shift their voice, change posture, and declare profound statements while staring into the fire. If you've ever been to a workshop where someone channels their inner spirit guide, you know the vibe. To an outsider, these rituals probably looked like mass fainting spells mixed with interpretive dance. But for the Egyptians, this was how you got your messages from the gods. Sometimes the divine advice was helpful. Warnings, blessings, maybe a tip about next season's floods. Sometimes the gods just demanded more cake, which tells you a lot about the priorities of both deities and worshippers. The line between spiritual revelation and snack break was always a little blurry. Not all trances were voluntary either. Ancient texts mention people being seized by gods. Cue the dramatic shaking, shouting, and clouds of incense thick enough to trigger a fire alarm. Was it genuine possession, or just the natural result of 4 hours spent inhaling temple smoke. The debate continues, but either way, it made for a memorable evening. Once the trance wore off, the returning host often looked dazed and extremely sweaty. The ritual ended with applause, a restorative sip of wine, and a nap behind a pillar, while the junior priests mopped up the sanctified drool. To modern eyes, the whole thing might look like performance art gone off the rails. But to the Egyptians, this was the spiritual main event, the moment when the wall between worlds turned to mist and the gods dropped in for a cameo. Death wasn't the ultimate party crasher either. In Egypt, the line between life and death was more of a polite suggestion, a little like don't swim right after eating, or maybe don't carve hieroglyphs when you're hammered. The dead weren't just remembered fondly, they were actively included in social plans. The Egyptians held festivals where families trekked out to the necropolis, picnic baskets in tow, ready to catch up with their dearly departed. Imagine a tailgate party. But the tailgate is a stone tomb, and the guest of honor is technically unavailable for comment. Families would gather outside their ancestors' resting places, unpacking food, pouring beer, and chatting with the tomb wall as if Grandma might answer back. Many tombs even came equipped with false doors, special portals through which the dead could receive offerings. Did it work? Who knows? But the Egyptians were convinced that the spirits could still enjoy music, food, and a juicy bit of family gossip. These reunions were lively affairs, music played, incense burned, and wine flowed freely. The living might get tipsy enough to confess their secrets, tear up with nostalgia, or accidentally sit on something sacred. It was like a family reunion. Only the arguments were replaced by respectful silence, and the side dish was embalming fluid. The idea wasn't just to remember the dead, it was to keep the relationship going. The living fed the dead, and in return the dead provided blessings, good harvests, protection from nightmares, and hopefully a break from any vengeful hippo gods. Sometimes people even slept overnight in the tombs, hoping to receive dream messages from their ancestors. Maybe Great Uncle Hom would pop in for a midnight pep talk. Stop loaning money to your brother. And for Ra's sake, the amulets go on the left. To us, this might sound a bit macabre, but for the Egyptians, it was just another family tradition. The afterlife wasn't a farewell. It was just a change of address, and you never knew when your relatives might drop by, spiritually anyway, for a quick catch-up. Of course, all this revelry came at a price. No matter how many Lotus petals you sprinkled in your wine, the morning after was brutal. Ancient medical texts may be suspiciously quiet about hangovers, but you can read between the lines. Pain in the head? That's code for had one too many divine encounters last night. Remedies ranged from herbal concoctions and honey to just lying very still and pretending you were deep in communion with the gods. If things got really dire, there was always the nuclear option, a ritual cleansing. This involved a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and a stern lecture about moderation that nobody actually remembered. But here's where the Egyptians truly mastered the art of spiritual spin. If you woke up with sandal marks on your face and a vague memory of serenading a statue, you didn't say, "I overdid it." You blamed it on the gods. "I was overcome by the divine," you'd announce, while discreetly searching for your missing sandal. Not a blackout, a mystical experience. Far more respectable. And for those who really pushed the envelope, the Egyptians had purgatives that were legendary for their cleansing properties. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like bad decisions and being assured, "This will restore your balance." Moments later, you're definitely restored, flat on the floor, swearing you'll never touch Blue Lotus again. The priests, naturally, handled these mornings better. They had training, authority, and most importantly, a well-practiced exit strategy. The average reveler just woke up, sticky, confused, and possibly missing an earring, left to wonder whether they'd communed with a god or just someone very persuasive in a leopard pelt. And yet, no one ever swore off the next festival. Because in ancient Egypt, spiritual enlightenment was as addictive as the wine itself. There was always another feast, another ritual, another chance to blur the borders between worlds and wake up with a story no one would believe. Speaking of blurred borders and the power behind the party, next up we'll step behind the gilded curtains to see who really ran these mystical shindigs. Because when ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. From the moment you set foot in ancient Egypt, trust me, I've been there, press badge and all, it's clear that priestly power wasn't just about who had the fanciest headpiece or the loudest chanting voice. The real flex was who held the keys to the temple storeroom, that ancient VIP lounge stacked with psychoactive herbs, sacred perfumes, and the legendary Blue Lotus stash every afterlife influencer raved about. Imagine the scene. Priests, Egypt's spiritual gatekeepers and unofficial pharmacists, gliding through temple corridors with incensed robes trailing, clutching the recipes for enlightenment, pain management, and the occasional 3-day vision quest. If you were lucky enough to get invited behind those carved stone doors, you weren't just signing up for a sermon. You were stepping into a full sensory experience that would put today's wellness retreats to shame. And here's the thing. All this exclusive access to mind-altering substances, it wasn't just about spiritual transcendence. It was the ultimate status symbol. The ancient Egyptian social pyramid, pun fully intended, was as carefully tiered as their tombs. At the top, the pharaoh, draped in cosmic bling and officially licensed to commune with the gods. Just below, the priests, whose job descriptions included everything from running the state's largest agricultural estates to orchestrating elaborate rites where the line between medical treatment and divine hallucination was, let's say, extremely flexible. Down below, the scribes, the artisans, and the folks whose spiritual enlightenment usually involved a mug of chewy barley beer and maybe a second-hand whiff of temple incense if the wind was blowing just right. But don't be fooled into thinking this was some kind of egalitarian spiritual festival. In reality, the priesthood ran the whole show, ritually, economically, and pharmacologically. If you wanted access to the good stuff, you either had to be born with the right bloodline, work your way up the sacred ranks, or hope to catch some of that Blue Lotus aroma as it drifted out of the temple windows. The priests controlled not only the means of production for mind-altering substances, but also the rituals that dictated when, how, and, most importantly, who got to indulge. It's the original members' only speakeasy, but instead of a secret knock, you needed a lifetime of devotion, and a healthy respect for hieroglyphic fine print. Let's talk about a typical day in the temple, as witnessed by yours truly, time-traveling party reporter. Picture the high priest, decked out in a leopard skin sash and eyeliner that could stop traffic on the Nile, preparing a sacred brew of blue lotus steeped in imported wine. Around him, a chorus of assistants fans incense smoke into the rafters, while scribes jot down the latest oracle visions. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh, the murmur of prayers, and the occasional giggle from an acolyte who got too close to the poppy resin. This isn't just a religious service. It's a carefully choreographed performance, a chemical symphony designed to blur the boundaries between the mortal and the divine. And it works. Because for the chosen few, these rituals really did open the doors of perception, at least for long enough to convince everyone else that the gods were on speed dial. The high priest's trance wasn't just for show. His visions were considered essential state intelligence, the ancient world's version of an emergency text from the universe. If he saw a golden falcon soaring over a field of blue, you could bet the year's harvest forecast was about to get a lot more optimistic. And if his dreams took a darker turn, well, hope you weren't the official in charge of irrigation that month. Meanwhile, outside the temple compound, the rest of Egypt watched this spectacle with a mix of awe, envy, and resignation. Most ordinary folks never got closer to the sacred stash than the faint traces of incense drifting over the city walls. Their daily experience with altered states was less transcendence and more survive. Another day in the sun, maybe with a side of homemade beer. If you were lucky, you might get a dose of poppy syrup for a toothache or a whiff of Kai-Fi incense during a festival. But the full mind-bending, reality-shifting experience, that was strictly reserved for the upper crust. And the exclusivity didn't stop with psychoactive substances. Beauty rituals, tattoos, and personal adornment all followed the same rigid social hierarchies. If you could afford exotic perfumes and coal imported from distant lands, you weren't just pampering yourself, you were broadcasting your status to everyone within sniffing distance. The elite bathed in blue lotus oil, applied malachite eyeshadow with gold-handled brushes, and wore tattoos that marked them as initiates in secret cults. Meanwhile, the majority settled for less glamorous options, mineral-based pigments mixed with animal fat, homegrown henna, and the occasional scar that doubled as both body art and proof you'd survived another building project. It's tempting to look back and laugh at the ancient obsession with ritual and status. But honestly, have you scrolled through your feed lately? Swap out Blue Lotus for adaptogenic smoothies and temple tattoos for microbladed brows, and you've basically got today's wellness landscape, just with fewer mummies and more hashtags. The Egyptian priesthood were the original wellness influencers, complete with exclusive content, members-only events, and a strict no pharaohs allowed policy when it came to the best trance-inducing blends. But there's a deeper thread running through all of this, one that ties the ancient world straight to our own restless, sleep-deprived age. Humans have always been searching for ways to break through the ordinary, whether it's through a sacred ceremony, a beauty ritual, or a wild night out. The tools and techniques change, but the hunger for altered states, for connection, for a glimpse of something bigger, never really goes away. Just ask the ancient Egyptians, who took their afterlife party prep so seriously They packed backup supplies for eternity, complete with instructions in case divine brain fog set in. And let's not pretend the priests weren't fully aware of the power they held. By controlling access to these transformative experiences, they reinforced their own authority and kept the social order humming along. Need a cure for insomnia? That'll be 2 offerings and a promise to never question the sacred recipes. Want to join the ranks of the initiated? Prepare for years of service, endless chanting, and a crash course in herb identification that would make a modern pharmacist weep. The system was rigged, but at least it came with great eyeliner and the occasional chance to see the gods up close, assuming you survived the ritual hangover. Now, before you picture the lower classes as totally shut out, let me set the record straight. There were moments, festivals, processions, and the occasional, oops, the temple doors are open situation, when the boundaries blurred and the commoners got a taste of the sacred. Maybe it was a watered-down brew. Maybe just the collective high of 1,000 people singing under the stars. But for a fleeting moment, everyone was part of the same cosmic dance. Then the priests closed the gates, the incense burned out, and it was back to reality, with the elite nursing their private stashes and everyone else swapping stories about that one time they almost met Osiris. It all begs the question, was this obsession with altered states just escapism, or was it something more profound? For the Egyptians, it was both survival strategy and spiritual quest. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower, and the search for meaning was inseparable from the search for pleasure. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were practical magic, designed to heal, inspire, and maybe, just maybe, make life a little less overwhelming. If that meant the high priest had to sample every batch for quality control, who are we to judge? Someone had to keep the visions coming. And here's a philosophical twist for you. Maybe the real lesson from ancient Egypt is less about who got the best stash and more about why we keep chasing these experiences in the first place. Across every era, every social class, people have risked, schemed, and sacrificed for a chance to feel more, see more, and understand more, whether that means downing a psychoactive beverage in a temple or booking a weekend retreat with a questionable wellness guru. We all want to transcend the mundane, to touch the mysteries, or at the very least, to get through the day with a little less pain. So, the next time someone scoffs at ancient rituals or rolls their eyes at historic beauty routines, just remember, the urge to change our minds, bodies, and spirits is as old as the pyramids. The only difference is the packaging. They had gold chalices and sacred incantations. We have reusable water bottles and guided meditation apps. It's all a remix of the same old song. And now, as the incense smoke of ancient Egypt clears and the blue lotus fades into memory, let's fast forward to a city where beauty became an obsession, and the price of perfection was often paid in pain. Get ready to join me in Florence, late 1400s. The Renaissance is about to turn the pursuit of appearance into high drama, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Take a deep breath, if you dare. The air is a swirling cocktail of incense, sweat, and the heavy perfume of crushed rose petals. Basically what you'd get if you ran a candle shop inside a gym locker. This is the beating heart of the Renaissance, where art, philosophy, and backstabbing politics are all the rage. But beneath the Da Vinci masterpieces and Machiavellian whispers, there's another fever sweeping the city, a full-blown obsession with beauty that's honestly just a little bit deranged. And not just any beauty, mind you. This is Renaissance beauty, where the goal is to look less like a sun-kissed goddess and more like you've been carved out of cold marble and haven't seen daylight since the Black Death. Let's talk about the star of the show, Sarasa. Imagine the most luxurious, shimmering white face paint money could buy, except it's made from lead. Yes, actual lead. The same stuff that comes with warning labels today. But in Florence, Venice, and basically every Renaissance hotspot, women are slathering this poisonous paste over their faces, necks, and chests like it's the secret to immortality. Why? Because in a world divided by class, pale skin is the ultimate status symbol. If your skin is tan, it means you've been outside, probably working, and that's just not the vibe. The paler and more porcelain you appear, the more you telegraph that you've never so much as glanced at a turnip in your life. Want to look like a living ghost? Perfect. That's the Renaissance dream. And they didn't just dab on a little powder. No, Sarasa was layered on thick, like frosting on a wedding cake. Some women even went to bed caked in it, refusing to wash their faces, letting the lead seep into every pore while they slept. The result? An otherworldly, ghostly radiance, at least until the inevitable sores and lesions cropped up. But did that stop them? Of course not. They just slapped on more lead, using it like a Renaissance Band-Aid, the kind that guarantees your skin will never heal and may actually start glowing in the dark. If you manage to dodge the lead, no worries. Mercury was here to pick up the slack. Mercury creams were the go-to for fading blemishes and sunspots. And if you've ever wondered what it's like to literally dissolve your skin for the sake of looking flawless, this was your chance. Add in arsenic-based tonics and daily vinegar face baths, and you've got a skincare routine that's less spa day and more chemical warfare. Renaissance elegance, brought to you by the periodic table and a complete disregard for mortality. Of course, all this beauty came with an extra dose of class warfare. Noble women aspired to look untouched by sunlight or human struggle. So the whiter the skin, the higher your social standing, or at least the greater your odds of fainting during church. Looking divine meant paying a divine price, anemia, hallucinations, and sometimes a one-way trip to the family crypt. But here's the real kicker. The same women poisoning themselves for the sake of beauty were also spritzing themselves with imported perfumes from the East, bathing in rose water, and sipping camphor tonics. So, while their skin was quietly peeling off in sheets, they smelled like a literal garden of angels. I can't decide if that's poetic or just deeply unsettling. And let's take a moment for the eyebrows. If you're picturing lush, expressive brows, think again. In Renaissance Florence, if you had visible eyebrows, you were obviously slacking. The ideal was to look like a freshly peeled egg or a Botticelli portrait, forehead stretching halfway up your scalp. Women plucked their eyebrows and hairlines into oblivion. Tweezers, rough cloths, even seashells were all fair game. This wasn't a once-and-done ordeal either. It was a weekly ritual of pain, a standing appointment with agony in the name of looking intelligent and noble. For the especially stubborn hairs, women turned to home remedies. Walnut oil, sure. Cat dung, yes, you heard that right. Cat dung was believed to thin regrowth. If that didn't do the trick, bring out the candle and literally burn the stray hairs away. Because nothing screams refined elegance like setting your face on fire before breakfast. If you managed to keep any brows at all, they were painted back on later, usually with burnt cork or powdered charcoal. Which sounds artsy, until the Florentine heat kicks in and your sophisticated new brows start melting down your cheeks in the middle of Mass. Divine, isn't it? Body hair didn't fare much better. It was seen as animalistic and downright unclean. The go-to removal method: a burning paste of vinegar, quicklime, and a dash of arsenic for that smooth, slightly radioactive finish. It stung like crazy, but hey, smooth skin is worth the pain, until it isn't. Now, let's talk about hair. The stuff on your head, that is. Hair was wrangled into impossibly tight braids and sculpted shapes, padded out with wool, horsehair, or even hair from other people. Blonde was the fashionable color, so wigs and hairpieces were dunked in lye and bleach until they reached just the right shade of sun-kissed, but never in the sun. And if your hairpiece didn't quite match, just pop on a cap and pretend it does. Renaissance problem-solving at its finest. All of this was accomplished without the benefit of mirrors. That's right, mirrors were rare and expensive, so most women styled themselves entirely by feel, with a little help from their maids. Hope your servant had steady hands and no unresolved grudges, because one wrong move and your regal widow's peak could become a medieval monk's tonsure faster than you can say Michelangelo. In the end, Renaissance beauty wasn't about natural charm or effortless allure. It was about strategic subtraction. Lose the brows, lose the hairline, lose your grip on basic hygiene and common sense, all for the sake of elegance. And just when you think Florence couldn't get any wilder, remember, this was only the beginning. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked, and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. The next stop on this grand tour of self-improvement was the body, specifically the rib cage. Yes, it was finally corset time. Now, if you're picturing the hourglass, fainting couch drama of later centuries, hold that thought. Renaissance corsets were a different beast, but still absolutely committed to the cause of beauty through mild orthopedic suffering. They called them stays or bodies, which sounds almost friendly until you see one up close. The main goal wasn't to create a wasp waist, so much as to flatten everything from the collarbones down into a stately, vertical board. The ideal Renaissance silhouette was less about curves and more about transforming yourself into a very chic, very expensive plank. Why seduce with softness when you could look like a fashionable drawbridge? Building one of these contraptions required materials best suited for minor home renovations. If you were rich, you'd demand whalebone, because what says luxury like harvesting the skeletons of the sea's largest mammals to keep your torso in line? For those on a less extravagant budget, the choices were reeds or pasteboard, which is basically cardboard's tough older cousin. All of it got stitched into linen, then laced up tighter than a Florentine banker's purse. Getting dressed was a full team sport. One woman to hold the laces, another to brace your shoulders, maybe a third to catch you if you temporarily lost vision from lack of oxygen. Once you were strapped in, you'd achieved Renaissance armor status. A noble woman in full dress was a walking, talking artichoke, layers upon layers, spikes of boning, and an air of delicate danger. And let's be clear, corsets weren't just about looking good. They were wearable morality clauses. A straight posture announced your virtue and self-control. Slouching? That signaled you were one step away from consorting with demons, or at the very least about to gossip behind someone's back. So the elite woman's day was spent standing ramrod straight, gliding stiffly through marble halls, and sucking in air with shallow, heroic breaths. If you fainted, congratulations, you'd reached peak fashion. Swooning in public was practically an Olympic event, and if you managed to do it gracefully while maintaining perfect posture, you just won Renaissance gold. Of course, all this elegance came with a price, and not just for your lungs. Florence in July was not what you'd call breezy, especially in a corset. Under all those layers, linen chemises soaked up sweat and hope in equal measure. Comfort was not on the dress code. The rules were simple. Elegance first, comfort never. But you know what? The corset did have one genuine perk. It kept everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Unlike modern bras that promise support, then spend the day slowly rolling up and plotting their own escape, Renaissance stays were the engineering marvels of their time. Think less lingerie and more load-bearing wall. You could dance, you could run, you could even faint, and not a single thing would budge. The only thing more stable was the Medici family's grip on Florence. Of course, these architectural wonders were reserved for those at the top of the social ladder. Working-class women skipped the boning and went with looser bodices and lighter fabrics. Their motto, breathe now, look fancy later. But for the elite, a corset was non-negotiable. You weren't considered fully dressed until you'd wrestled your torso into place. Anything less was social ruin, like showing up to the Met Gala in sweatpants. Now, here's where things get truly paradoxical. Once you'd armored up, you still had to eat. And by eat, I mean participate in the Renaissance version of competitive nibbling. Imagine being invited to a banquet with tables groaning under the weight of roasted peacocks, marzipan palaces, and fruit dipped in enough gold leaf to pay off a small duchy. The catch? You're laced so tight your stomach is basically folded in half, and the only thing going down easily is air. Noble women were expected to feast with the best of them, at least in theory. In practice, eating was a performance art. You could take tiny, polite bites, maybe sip a little wine, but heaven help you if you tried to actually enjoy a drumstick. Open your mouth too wide and you risked a wardrobe malfunction, or worse, the horror of a visible exhale. So dinner was this delicate ballet of posture, propriety, and trying not to pass out into your cold eel pie. Fainting during a meal? That was just another way to signal your commitment to both beauty and drama. You might collapse into the nearest silk-clad courtier, earning admiration and, probably, a little jealousy. Behind the scenes, though, even the best dressed had their limits. Many noble women, after hours of dainty public eating, would retire to their rooms, peel themselves out of their stays, and descend upon hidden caches of candied fruit and leftover cheese like starved raccoons in a jewelry box. Midnight snacking, now, as then, the great equalizer. Of course, Renaissance beauty rituals extended right to the plate. Certain foods were considered dangerous to your complexion. Cucumbers were a no-go, said to make your skin as watery as your resolve after 3 hours in a corset. Wine, on the other hand, was encouraged for its rosy-cheeked afterglow. Some women even drank vinegar tonics to keep their figures trim. Because nothing says, "I value my health," like voluntarily acid washing your insides. Digestion, meanwhile, was an extreme sport. With your stomach squeezed flat against the wall of whalebone, every bite was a calculated risk. Eat too quickly, and you'd risk indigestion, bloating, or, brace yourself, a highly unladylike burp. That, more than anything, could ruin your social standing faster than a bad fresco. So, while the men lounged, argued about Dante, and knocked back flagons of questionable Chianti, women mastered the art of eating in slow motion, smiling serenely through the pain, and never, ever letting their seams give way. True beauty in Renaissance Italy was a full-body commitment, 1 part fashion, 1 part fortitude, and just a dash of fainting for dramatic effect. And once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tightened, and the food politely nibbled, there was still one crucial element left before you could conquer the dance floor of Florence's hottest palazzo. You had to smell as expensive as you looked. Because nothing says, "I'm ready to party with the Medici," like a cloud of imported scent and a pair of shoes you can barely walk in. Let's dive nose first into the wild world of Renaissance perfume, scandalous fabrics, and the social spectacle of the dance. Here's your undercover scoop from the front lines of Renaissance Florence's most exclusive soirée. In this era, scent wasn't just a personal flourish. It was your passport to high society. Nobles didn't just want to look expensive. They wanted to smell like they had just been imported from a far-off, mysterious port, preferably one with 0 garlic and an overabundance of rare spices. Let's be clear, the nose was the real judge at these parties. If you were anyone at all, your fragrance had to hit the room before you did. The average commoner might be marinated in eau de goat, with top notes of wood smoke and existential panic. But the elite, they moved through crowded salons and echoing basilicas like sentient bouquets, trailing clouds of rosewater, musk, and that ever-enigmatic ambergris. If you walked past a duchess and didn't feel at least a little lightheaded, she needed to fire her perfumer immediately. Perfume wasn't a side hustle in Renaissance Italy. It was a full-blown industry. Venice was basically the Sephora of Europe, but the truly sought-after ingredients came from the ends of the known world. Picture it: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and, if you were really showing off, ambergris. Yes, that semi-mystical waxy substance excavated from sperm whale intestines. It cost more than a villa, and smelled like oceanic mystery with a faint whiff of "do not ask questions." Slathering yourself in this stuff was the Renaissance equivalent of dousing yourself in a fragrance so rare. Even the whales were jealous. And let's not kid ourselves. Perfume wasn't just for wrists and necks. It seeped into every part of your arsenal. Gloves were soaked in it. Dress linings were saturated. Handkerchiefs, the ultimate status symbol, were drenched and waved at anyone who looked remotely unsanitary. This was less about modest flirtation and more about olfactory self-defense. The streets of Florence weren't exactly known for their cleanliness. Bathtubs were more rumor than reality, so perfume doubled as both shield and sword. The true connoisseurs, though, didn't stop at a single spritz. Scent layering was an art form. First came a bath, if you could call it that, in rosewater or camphor, which was less a soak and more a quick rinse of your better parts. Then, a dusting of powdered violet petals to sweeten things up. Next, a scented oil massaged into temples or wrists for that lingering effect. And finally, your apothecary's most potent concoction, guaranteed to make rivals swoon and poets burst into tragic sonnets. Some wore pomanders, delicate perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs, dangling from their belts like tiny, fragrant warning signs. Smell me at your own risk. I am armed with cinnamon and judgment. Of course, not every potion was a crowd pleaser. Some perfumes packed so much turpentine or dubious herbal extracts that one whiff could send you into a headache spiral or knock you right into a fainting couch. The line between irresistible and insufferable was razor thin. But if you nailed it, people noticed. A woman who smelled divine had a certain power, the power to enchant, distract, or simply outlast the stench of the masses. In a throng of unwashed poets, you were a rose among thorns. But if scent was your invisible armor, fashion was your shield, and Florence was the battlefield. Here, your outfit didn't just hint at your status. It declared it in bold, embroidered font. Velvet was the undisputed monarch of the fabric world. It was thick, impossibly heavy, and as expensive as a small palace. Wearing velvet in the blistering heat, that was a flex and a half. You were about to faint, yes, but you were going to look incredible doing it. Brocade, on the other hand, wasn't satisfied with mere color. No, it demanded attention with woven patterns, lions, vines, even entire biblical scenes rendered in gold thread. Subtlety had clearly left the chat. These were not just outfits. They were wearable altarpieces. The more intricate your pattern, the more you could smugly nod at the woman next to you and silently announce, "Checkmate on inferior sleeves." Speaking of sleeves, they were detachable, a feature that turned into a kind of competitive fashion-forward arms race. Wealthy women collected sleeves the way modern influencers hoard limited-edition handbags. Sleeves came embroidered, puffed, slashed, or bejeweled, and sometimes a single pair was so elaborate it needed its own storage trunk and possibly a dedicated servant to keep track of it. Swapping out sleeves became the 16th century version of outfit changes during an awards show. And let's talk color, because every shade was a secret code. Deep blues and rich crimsons came from pigments so rare they were worth locking in a vault. Lapis lazuli and cochineal dyes were the luxury cars of the palette, and sumptuary laws occasionally tried and failed spectacularly to reserve them for the nobility. Let's just say, when there's a law against a dress, you can bet someone's going to wear it twice as hard. Even the underlayers weren't immune to extravagance. Chemises were trimmed with lace, petticoats flashed silk at every chance, and girdles, think ornate belts, were decked out with gemstones and secret compartments. Forget fanny packs? These were the original utility belts, stashing everything from perfume vials to tiny prayer books, or possibly the occasional revenge note. But all this came at a staggering price. A single Renaissance gown could cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. And it wasn't just about owning the dress. You needed a new one for every event. Wearing the same thing twice? Social death? The pressure to maintain this dizzying wardrobe was relentless. Every gathering was an audition, and every outfit was your resume. Now, let's pan down a bit. Fashion didn't stop at the ankle, but honestly, you weren't supposed to see anyone's ankles anyway. Modesty reigned supreme, which is hilarious considering the absolute circus happening below the hemline. Enter the infamous Chopin, the shoe that turned every street into a catwalk/obstacle course. These Venetian imports were essentially platform stilts for your feet, originally designed to lift your precious skirts above the mud and whatever else was lurking in the alleyways. But the Renaissance being what it was, practical quickly mutated into theatrical. Chopins soared to heights of over 20 inches. That's right, 20 inches. Wearing them required circus-level balance, a couple of loyal handmaidens for support, and the willingness to risk public humiliation for the sake of fashion. One wrong step, and you weren't just falling, you were taking half the dance floor with you. Florentines, ever so slightly more sensible, kept their platform shoes a little less skyscraper. Indoors, noble women wore delicate, pointed slippers crafted from velvet, stitched with silk, and sometimes lined with fur, because nothing says, "I'm rich," quite like sweating through your socks in the middle of July. These were not made for outside. When braving the filthy streets, you wore patterns, chunky wooden or cork soles strapped beneath your dainty slippers, elevating you just enough to dodge puddles and whatever the horses left behind. Practical? Sure, in theory, until you tripped and performed an impromptu slapstick routine across the cobblestones. And while we're on the subject of feet, let's address the Renaissance obsession with daintiness. Foot binding wasn't on the Italian menu, but the pressure was real. Shoes were narrow, pointed, and designed more for posing than for actual walking. But who needed to walk anyway, when you could float from litter to ballroom, leaving a trail of crushed petals and, occasionally, crushed dignity? Stockings were another hidden battleground. Finely knit silk or wool hose climbed up to the knee, tied in place with ribbons, sometimes perfumed, because if your ankles did make a cameo appearance, they'd better smell divine. Scented ribbons, the ultimate flex for the 1%. Meanwhile, the working classes had to settle for shoes that actually worked. Sturdy leather for farm work, clogs for slogging through muck. Functional, yes, but definitely not eligible for the Florence Fashion Hall of Fame. The nobility, by contrast, turned footwear into a secret weapon, unseen, wildly impractical, and so costly you'd hesitate to let them touch the ground. All of these layers, these lavish shoes, the fainting fits and fashion feuds, they were gearing you up for one thing: the dance. Yes, after hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, and propped up on architectural footwear, it was time to glide gracefully, or attempt to, across polished marble floors in what looked suspiciously like body armor. Courtly dances were a spectacle unto themselves. We're not talking about the rowdy reels you might find in a tavern. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, rigidly choreographed, and about as forgiving as a high school gym teacher. Every step, every gesture was loaded with hidden meaning. Put your foot wrong, and you might as well have scrawled, "Please gossip about me," across your forehead. Social mobility, one misstep away from disaster. The most popular dances, the pavane, the galliard, required you to float in stately patterns, gaze demurely at the floor, and, under no circumstances, breathe through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which was particularly rough since your corset had already reduced your lung capacity to that of an anxious squirrel. Every leap in the galliard was a gamble. Would you land with grace, or would you pass out and be carried off in a cloud of scented ribbons? But make no mistake, dancing was high-stakes social warfare. Your moves on the dance floor were as crucial as your marriage prospects. Parents hired dance tutors with the same fervor. Modern influencers hire social media managers. Lessons covered everything: how to turn, how to bow, how to flutter your fan, just enough to look mysterious, but not so much that you appeared in danger of a heat stroke. The real trick was to project an aura of effortless calm. While your toes bled, your ribs shrieked for mercy, and your face tried desperately not to drip. There was an art to suffering gracefully, and the Renaissance elite had perfected it. The illusion of ease was everything. Of course, the dance floor was also a rare moment for flirtation. Under the watchful eyes of parents, chaperones, and a small army of gossips. Gloved hands brushed, eyes met during a bow, fragrances mingled in a fleeting, scented truce. It was like speed dating, if speed dating involved more fainting and fewer opportunities to speak. But beware, a single missed step, a laugh too loud, or a bow, shade too deep, could unravel your carefully constructed mystique. The audience, other women, servants, even the musicians, were all ready to pass judgment. A clumsy twirl could haunt your reputation for weeks. Perfection was expected. Collapse was always an option. So you danced, smiled, and endured, maintaining the illusion that your suffering was merely the price of elegance. And when the music paused and you were finally released from the battlefield, you'd excuse yourself for a quick visit to the powder room. Time to mop your brow, rescent your ribbons, and psych yourself up for the next round. And with that, the night began to wind down. The candles guttered, the music faded, and the golden haze of perfume and sweat drifted through the emptying hall. The guests had departed, but the real stories, those whispered beauty secrets and inked symbols, were just waiting to be revealed behind closed doors and across the seas, where nightly rituals in Florence and the mysterious world of Japanese tattooing were about to take center stage. When the last guest had tottered out, their powdered wigs askew and their dignity trailing behind like a forgotten fan, Florence's most glamorous noblewoman was left alone in her candlelit chamber. If you think she flopped straight into bed, think again. This was Renaissance Florence, the birthplace of the high-maintenance bedtime routine, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to sleep with half a pound of toxic face paint still glued on. So, as the final drops of wax surrendered to gravity and the night pressed in through her latticed windows, the real work began. Picture this: the great unmasking. Off come the silk veils, followed by the first pass with a linen cloth. Next, she reaches for a bowl of rose water, swirling it around as if prepping for a medieval skincare commercial. But here's where things get spicy. The main ingredient in her beauty arsenal. Raw egg whites. That's right. Think of it as an organic, gluten-free Renaissance sheet mask. Except this one turns your pores into a breakfast buffet. She dabs it all over, hoping it'll coax the layers of lead-based Sarusa foundation to slide off without taking half her face with it. This stuff wasn't just makeup. It was a geological event, and getting it off took the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb disposal squads. Now, she's dabbing and wiping, praying the almond oil and a splash of sharp vinegar will dissolve the day's artistry, rather than reveal a new constellation of rashes underneath. Spoiler alert, the results are usually more horror show than glow-up. But there's no time for self-pity. Not in Florence, where tomorrow's beauty stakes are just as high. Next up, the hair. Or, more accurately, whatever's left of it after years of chemical warfare. She gingerly untwists the pins and carefully unspools fake braids, each attached with a cocktail of sticky herbs and questionable adhesives. It's a tense moment, because if the herbal glue doesn't give, she's at risk of pulling away more than just the wig. And remember, earlier this week, she'd slathered her forehead in a blend of cat dung and quicklime, all in pursuit of that oh-so-chic receding hairline. Now, as she inspects the damage in the mirror, she prays she hasn't gone from high fashion to accidental friar. On to the corset. This isn't just undressing. It's a spiritual awakening. The laces come undone with a sound halfway between a gasp and a groan, as ribs spring back to shape in a process that's equal parts relief and chiropractic event. One deep, luxurious breath is all she gets before the memory of the day's suffocation makes her vow, yet again, never again. Of course, she'll be right back at it tomorrow. Now, for the grand foot reveal. She slips off her dainty slippers and is confronted with toes that look like they've survived a medieval torture device. If she's lucky, her loyal servant sets down a basin filled with warm water, steeped with sprigs of lavender or rosemary. For a few blissful minutes, she soaks her aching feet and remembers what joy felt like. If not, she simply stares at her mangled toes and wonders if she'll ever walk without wincing again. The final flourish in this nightly performance, a rub down with sweet-smelling oils if she's feeling decadent, or, for the more paranoid, a dash of alchemical tonic promised to preserve youth. The scent is less eternal beauty and more medieval copper mine with a hint of beetle. But, as the saying goes, beauty is pain, and occasionally pestilence. At last, she leans in to extinguish the candle. Not a dramatic huff, heaven forbid. That's too vulgar, but a delicate puff, as if apologizing to the flame for ending its night so soon. She sinks onto the mattress, her hairline inching further north with every passing season, skin a shade paler than any ghost story, and lungs finally free from corset captivity. She knows tomorrow will bring the same ordeal, but in Florence, beauty isn't just skin deep, it's a full contact sport, a 24/7 performance with critics lurking in every shadow. And while our noblewoman drifts off, plotting tomorrow's beauty battle, let's catch the first bullet train to Edo period, Japan, where the night winds carry a different kind of story. one inked not with powder and paste, but with needles and pigment. All right, now imagine me, your time-traveling party reporter, slipping off my borrowed Renaissance slippers, dusting the lead powder from my jacket, and ducking into the misty alleyways of Edo. The city hums with lantern light, merchants haggling, and 1,000 secret tales swirling beneath the surface. Here, tattoos weren't always badges of rebellion or underworld affiliations. In fact, before the word Yakuza even hit the rumor mill, Japanese tattoos carried a complex identity, woven deeply into the fabric of labor, honor, and myth. Back in the distant past, long before the Edo period's neon glow-up, tattoos in Japan were less about personal style and more about public shaming. Criminals caught stealing or breaking laws were branded, literally, with marks burned or etched into their faces and arms. Think of it as the world's worst loyalty program. Collect 3 strikes, get a permanent facial tattoo, and a lifetime supply of social exile. But by the 1600s, something fascinating happened. The crude marks that once screamed outcast started to evolve, blossoming into something beautiful and intricate. Tattoos became art, devotion, and spiritual armor, all rolled into one and all hidden just beneath your kimono. Edo society was a pressure cooker of rules. The Tokugawa shogunate, with its ironclad grip, dictated everything from the fabric of your robe to the height of your social aspirations. Samurai flashed swords, merchants counted coins, and the rest of the population was left with little more than a rule book and a prayer. The authorities wanted a society so orderly you could set your clock by it. Ornate clothing, luxurious silks, anything remotely fabulous, reserved for those at the top. But humans, as always, proved gloriously allergic to conformity. So what did the commoners do? They turned rebellion into an art form. If you couldn't wear brocade on the outside, you wore it on your skin. Hidden beneath the drab uniforms of laborers, firemen, and gamblers, full-body tattoos flourished. They only revealed their secret masterpieces in the privacy of bathhouses, at riotous festivals, or in the quiet intimacy of a lover's embrace. This was more than decoration. It was silent, stubborn resistance. Every tattoo told a story. You might see a koi fish fighting its way upstream, an emblem of perseverance through hardship, like a motivational poster you can never take down. Dragons curled around shoulders, promising power and protection. Cherry blossoms drifted along arms, marking the beauty and brevity of life. These weren't random doodles. They were earned, symbol-laden badges, chosen carefully and etched one agonizing inch at a time. And let's talk about the process. Forget numbing cream or digital tattoo guns. Edo tattoo artists, known as horishi, used wooden handles and clusters of steel needles. They hand-poked ink beneath the skin, mixing pigments from charcoal and minerals, then hammering them in with a steady rhythm. The pain was legendary. A full bodysuit could take years, hours at a time, each session a marathon of endurance. You didn't just wear a tattoo, you survived it. By the end, your skin was a living mural, and you, whether you were a fireman, a gambler, or a wandering poet, were transformed into a walking storybook. But make no mistake, this was all very much illegal. The shogunate considered tattoos wasteful, vulgar, or simply too unruly for their taste. Irizumi, as the art was called, thrived in the shadows. The ruling elite pretended not to see, while the rest admired or feared those marked with forbidden ink. Nowhere did this underground artistry burn brighter than among Edo's firemen, the Haikshi. Forget everything you know about modern firefighters. These guys didn't have hoses or flame-retardant suits. Their toolkit was made up of hooks, axes, and pure, undiluted bravado. When a fire broke out, and that happened a lot in a city made almost entirely of wood, the Haikshi didn't try to put out the flames. Instead, they tore down nearby buildings, creating fire breaks with their bare hands, while embers rained from the sky like apocalyptic confetti. This was a brotherhood forged in heat and danger, and central to their culture was the tattoo. The Haikshi adopted full-body suits of swirling dragons, roaring tigers, deities, and demons. These weren't vanity projects. A dragon across your back was spiritual armor. A tiger on your chest was a talisman of courage. The pain of being tattooed for hours on end? That was the point. If you could endure that, you could stand atop a burning rooftop while the city burned beneath you. Sometimes, entire crews would get matching motifs, identical dragons, waves, or blossoms, inked across their bodies, like an early version of the ultimate team uniform. But this wasn't gang territory. It was solidarity, a declaration that you belonged to a brotherhood willing to face down the flames together. The authorities might have frowned, but the neighborhoods cheered. Hikishi were local heroes, their inked bodies hidden under work clothes, but revealed in bathhouses or during wild festival nights, where even the most pious townsfolk would turn a blind eye. To the elite, these men were dangerous, disorderly. To the people, they were the ones who saved lives. Their tattoos marked them as both protectors and rebels. But the firemen weren't the only ones inking their identities. Down in the floating world, Edo's pleasure quarters and gambling dens, a different crowd carried the tradition forward. Here, the night belonged to the Bakuto, professional gamblers with a taste for risk, a love of dice, and the kind of personal style that would make a modern influencer weep with envy. These drifters and rogues moved from town to town, living on their wits and their own strict codes of honor. Society might have shoved them to the margins, but with every needle prick, they claimed a new piece of dignity. Their tattoos were loud, swaggering statements, peonies for prosperity, gods of fortune for luck, fierce warriors, and writhing snakes. These weren't the quiet, meditative designs of monks or the proud badges of firemen. These were visual declarations. I play by my own rules. Many of their motifs came straight from kabuki theater and Japanese folklore. Heroes who defied authority. Mythical rebels who thumbed their noses at the established order. The more outlandish the character, the greater the respect. Tattoos became a kind of branding, a way of carving out an identity in a world that refused to offer one. Each mark was a story of rebellion, pain, and pride. And let's not forget the logistics. The Bakuto were more than just gamblers. They were the glue of Edo's underground, lending money, keeping order in the pleasure districts, and laying the groundwork for what would one day become the Yakuza. Their tattoos were both a shield and a warning. Loyalty on the inside, danger on the outside. Tattoo studios flourished in this hidden world. You wouldn't find them advertised on street corners. Instead, word of mouth did the trick. The best horishi were whispered about in bathhouses, their reputations growing with every masterpiece. To be tattooed by a master was a badge of honor. To endure the pain was proof of grit. For the robes and gamblers, irizumi wasn't just art. It was a hard-won identity, worn proudly in a society that offered no easy path. So, as the candles sputter out in Florence and the ink dries in the back alleys of Edo, one thing becomes clear. Beauty, pain, rebellion, and ritual aren't confined to any one place or time. Whether you're scrubbing off egg whites in a perfumed chamber or sitting for hours as a horishi hammers dragons into your skin, the human urge to transcend, to stand out, to belong, and to suffer a little for the privilege. Now that's a tradition older than history itself. But before you think this was all just a boys' club of tough firemen and swaggering gamblers, let's take a closer look at the women and the hidden hands who shaped this world of ink. Because, trust me, the story of irizumi isn't just written in masculine bravado. Sometimes, history's most intricate tattoos came from the most unexpected artists. Though tattooing in Edo, Japan is often portrayed as a masculine tradition of laborers, firefighters, and gamblers, women also left their mark, sometimes quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. Let's drop into Edo, Japan. Think of it as the original city that never sleeps, only everyone's on way less caffeine and way more social anxiety. Now, if you're picturing irizumi as just a boys' club, sweaty firemen, rowdy gamblers, those legendary laborers flexing their ink in bathhouses, pause right there. Underneath all those layers of silk and etiquette, women were quietly writing their own stories in ink, sometimes in places only a lover or a very curious time traveler with a press badge would ever see. These weren't the billboard-sized dragons and thunder gods splashed across broad male backs. No. Women's tattoos in Edo were often small, hidden, and heartbreakingly intimate. They were tucked inside the upper arm, secreted away on the inner thigh, or just below the collarbone, where a robe might slip to reveal a flash of forbidden art. This whole trend had a name: irizumi chobun, or love tattoos. Forget texting your crush at 2 a.m. Here, lovers inked each other's names on their bodies. A permanent DM slid under the radar of respectable society. One phrase was a favorite, ininoi azukasu, which translates as, I entrust you with my life. Imagine that, declaring your ride-or-die status, not with matching phone wallpapers, but with a vow literally carved into your skin. It was devotion, but with a side order of pain, and definitely not parent-approved. Men joined in too, sometimes carrying the same inscriptions, like some mutual secret handshake that no wedding ceremony could match. But the epicenter of this inky romance? The pleasure quarters of the ukiyo, the floating world, where courtesans and geishas spun fantasies for samurai, merchants, and anyone with enough coins jingling in their sleeves. Here, tattoos were more than decoration. They were weapons of seduction. Picture a high-ranking courtesan, layers of fabric artfully disheveled, letting a client glimpse a delicate mark near her hip or collarbone. He'd think he was in on a private secret, not realizing that the same tattoo had probably been flashed to half the clientele, each convinced he was the chosen one. The illusion of intimacy, mass-produced. Ido's answer to the personalized influencer shout-out. Of course, not every tattoo was about love. Sometimes heartbreak left its own mark. If a courtesan was abandoned, she might burn or slash the name tattooed on her skin, turning what was once a badge of passion into a scar, a kind of emotional receipt. Others would cover up names with new designs, a dragon swallowing the old letters, or waves rolling in to erase a memory. It was the ultimate new year, new me, energy, but with a lot more blood and existential drama. And outside the pleasure districts, tattoos could be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant women, fisherwomen, even wives of tattooed men sometimes joined the inked underground. Maybe they'd seen their husbands come home, chest blazing with a new tiger or koi, and decided to get a tiny blossom or phrase hidden beneath their own robes. There was risk, social shame, whispers in the market, a sideways glance from the neighbor whose idea of a wild time was an extra scoop of rice. But for these women, tattoos were a silent rebellion, a private declaration of agency in a world that rarely listened to their voices. Officially, Edo society clucked its tongue and shook its head at the idea of tattooed women. Unladylike, they said, as if the pain, courage, and meaning inked into those secret places could be wiped away with a disapproving frown. But these tattoos stitched together a hidden narrative, an unrecorded history of love, choice, and defiance, written not in scrolls but in skin. Now, let's step into the smoky, incense-laced layers of the true magicians behind this phenomenon. The Horishi, the tattoo masters of Edo. You won't see a neon sign or a 5-star Yelp review outside their doors. Instead, you'd find them in the back rooms above tea houses, behind discreet barber shops, or in candle-lit apartments that always smelled like a blend of ink, rice paper, and a hint of nervous sweat. Their names didn't show up in official ledgers. They moved through society as shadowy legends, their reputations traveling on the hush-hush express, whispered from one inked client to another. Becoming a Horishi was not something you picked up at a weekend workshop. This was a commitment. Years of grueling apprenticeship under a master, learning the fine art of controlled pain and the delicate dance between needle and flesh. The tools were simple: a wooden handle, a cluster of steel needles, and thick black sumi ink made from soot and animal glue. Every step was hand-powered, no humming electric machines, just the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of needles driven by a bamboo mallet. The technique, known as tebori, demanded the patience of a Zen monk and the pain threshold of a stunt double. But Horishi weren't just technicians. They were therapists, historians, and secret keepers. A great tattoo master had to know not only how to wield a needle, but also what story to tell. Every design was loaded with meaning: a cherry blossom fading into waves, life's fleeting beauty, a tiger climbing a mountain, raw ambition against the odds. You might show up with a grand idea, but the Horishi decided where it went, how it flowed, how your story fit onto the map of your body. Some clients would return for years, session after session, building a bodyscape from shoulder to thigh, back to arms, always careful to keep the ink hidden under everyday clothes. just in case the authorities peeked beneath the kimono. And the signatures? Forget a flashy artist's tag. Horishi hid their marks deep in the art, a tiny brushstroke tucked into the curl of a dragon's tail, or a secret kanji spiraled inside a lotus petal. Only the truly initiated knew what to look for. It was the tattoo world's version of an Easter egg, and a secret handshake all at once. Despite the intimacy of their art, Horishi lived on the edge. Their clients were outsiders, firemen, gamblers, courtesans, people who lived by their own rules, outside the gilded gates of the elite. The tattoo masters belonged to this liminal world too, revered by the underground, ignored by the powerful, always one bad rumor away from trouble. Irizumi was not something you just wore like a statement necklace. It was something you survived. Every stretch of color, every swirling line, was bought with hours of endurance and days of aching flesh. In Edo, the pain wasn't a design flaw. It was the entire point. Tibori, the hand-poked method, was slow, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. The master would dip the cluster of needles into the black ink and tap them into your skin, over and over, for hours. A single outline might take an afternoon. A full bodysuit could require years of regular visits, each lasting half the day if you could handle it. There were no numbing creams, no take a break if you're feeling faint. Just the relentless tap of wood on steel, the raw burn of ink entering flesh, and maybe the distant sound of chanting from a nearby temple to remind you that suffering was, in fact, part of the package. Clients didn't just get tattoos. They earned them. The pain was a barrier to entry, a test of will. In the bathhouses and taverns, endurance became a badge of honor. Firefighters claimed the agony made them braver. Gamblers said it tested their luck. Courtesans and lovers wore their pain as a testament to emotional depth, as if every sting was proof of feeling too much. Some came seeking punishment, others purification. And there was a spiritual side. Enduring pain was a kind of discipline, like fasting or meditation. Buddhist themes weren't just on trend. They were a spiritual flex. Suffering, rebirth, enlightenment. The ink told a story, but the pain wrote its own. Each session brought not just more color, but a step closer to transformation. And rules? Oh, there were rules. You couldn't flinch. You couldn't yelp. And if you squirmed too much, the Horishi might scold you, or worse, botch the design. Only the most hardcore made it through to a full bodysuit, known as munewari, with a chest panel left blank so you didn't scandalize the neighborhood if your robe slipped open at the wrong moment. While the elites measured status in silk and the size of their rice bowl, the tattooed measured it in pain and permanence. Every inch of an Edo tattoo was a story, mythology mapped right onto the body, like a living, breathing graphic novel. These weren't random doodles picked off a wall. Each symbol was chosen with care, stacked with meaning, and arranged to turn your body into a private legend. Take koi fish, for example. They weren't just pretty. A koi swimming upstream meant grit, determination, the guts to keep going when the world says no. The legend went that a koi who reached the top of the waterfall would transform into a dragon, a perfect metaphor for anyone hustling their way up from the bottom, trying to prove themselves in a world stacked against them. Dragons, too, were everywhere, but not the fire-breathing monsters of Western fairy tales. These dragons were guardians, wise and powerful, closely tied to nature's forces. A dragon coiling across the back wasn't about scaring the neighbors. It was about protection. A supernatural bouncer, always on duty between your skin and whatever life threw at you. Peonies brought a touch of elegance to all that bravery. Tigers roared with ferocity and resolve, and waves reminded everyone that life could turn on you faster than a samurai's temper. Demons and ghosts wormed their way into the mix too, warnings and cautionary tales inked as reminders of the dangers lurking everywhere, both seen and unseen. Some tattoos told whole stories, scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, epic battles, heartbreaking betrayals, gods crashing into human affairs. One favorite was the Suikoden, an epic saga about one-hate outlaw heroes. For the tattooed classes, rebels, protectors, misfits, these stories hit close to home. They weren't samurai, but they still lived by a code. Buddhist deities were popular, especially the wrathful ones. Fudo Myo, the immovable protector, was a crowd favorite. Sword in one hand, rope in the other, he was always ready to bind demons or cut through ignorance. Having him tattooed across your back was basically strapping on a spiritual bodyguard, one who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. But not all meanings were one size fits all. Placement, size, direction, they all mattered. A tiger climbing up meant ambition. Going down? That was a warning. Even the order in which each panel was added told the world something about your journey. These designs were sacred, private, and powerful, a coded language for a society that always seemed to be listening. In Edo, where words could betray you and secrets were currency, tattoos became the truest form of self-expression. Every hidden blossom, every coiling dragon or slashing wave, was a chapter in a story only you and your tattoo master could read. But as Edo's underground tattoo culture flourished, the outside world was starting to take notice. The question wasn't just who wore ink, but what that ink meant, and how long the authorities would let this secret language of pain and power continue to whisper beneath the surface. As the Edo period progressed, the vibrant underground culture of Irizumi, once a secret code of honor among laborers, firemen, and gamblers, began to collide head-on with shifting social attitudes and rising paranoia from the ruling class. If you've ever tried to get into a fancy Japanese bathhouse and been turned away because of a little ink on your arm, congratulations. You've just time-traveled into the enduring legacy of Edo period tattoo stigma. Picture me, undercover with my trusty press pass and a hidden GoPro, sneaking through the steam and whispers of 19th century Japan. The place is buzzing with more gossip than a high school cafeteria, and the air is thick with the kind of tension you only get when pleasure meets suspicion. And let me tell you, what's about to unfold is less sleep stories and more live from the front lines of the weird history wars. Back in the days when samurai hairstyles were trending and sumo wrestlers were the original influencers, tattoos, known as irizumi, were badges of honor. Firefighters, laborers, and gamblers all sported elaborate body art, each design pulsing with secret meaning. But as the Edo period rolled on, this underground art scene started bumping up against a tidal wave of top-down suspicion. The shogunate was suddenly obsessed with order, and anything that looked too wild, too bold, or too much fun got side-eyed hard. Here's where it got spicy. The Bakuto, those proto-gamblers who'd later inspire the Yakuza, were the only ones gutsy enough to strut around with their full-body suits on display. Imagine a group of guys at Coachella, but instead of flower crowns, they're draped in dragons, tigers, and koi that twist from collarbone to ankle. At first, these men were rebels with a cause, using ink to forge an identity the world kept trying to strip away. But as criminal gangs got organized, tattoos shifted from symbols of resilience to markers of turf and loyalty. Suddenly, a coiled dragon on your back didn't mean courage, it screamed, "Watch out, I'm with them." I'm standing on a crowded Edo street, dodging rickshaws and eavesdropping on a couple of local merchants. One's whispering, "Did you see the marks on that man's arm?" The other shudders. "Keep your distance." Tattoos have officially gone from cool to criminal faster than you can say forbidden fruit. The government, never one to miss a party they can ruin, swings the hammer, more bans, harsher punishments, and a crackdown that would make a modern narcotics task force jealous. By the early 1800s, tattooing's outlaw status is spreading faster than a viral meme. Depending on where you live and who's checking, you might get away with a little wrist ink, or you could end up in serious trouble. I slip into a back alley parlor, ducking behind a Norran curtain, and find a Horishi, a master tattooist, working in near silence. His tools are hidden in a rice jar, and the client has arrived using a password that sounds like an order for extra pickles, but really means, "Give me the dragon, but make it discreet." The Horishi's hands are steady, his eyes darting to the door every time a shadow passes outside. Now, you'd think the crackdown would chill the whole scene. But if history's taught us anything, it's that banning something only makes it cooler. Instead of fading away, Irizumi just dove deeper, both underground and under the skin. Artists started inventing clever ways to hide tattoos beneath layers of dark ink, or weaving them into designs so complex that even the nosiest official would be bamboozled. Getting tattooed became a secret handshake, a dare, and sometimes a full-on act of rebellion. But the stigma wasn't just about the law. It seeped into daily life, sticking to you like that one persistent relative at family gatherings. If you had visible tattoos, good luck getting into a bathhouse, a temple, or anyone's good graces. Respectable families wouldn't let their kids marry you. Your ink was seen as vulgar, dangerous, maybe even evil. The same images that once protected firefighters or told a gambler's life story now marked you as an outcast. Whole generations started hiding their skin, their stories, their pride. Still, the art didn't die. Like a dragon curled in shadow, it waited. For every government raid, there was a new way to slip past the rules. For every temple door slammed shut, someone opened the window of a tiny candle-lit studio. I watch as an apprentice mixes ink from soot and sake, passing the recipe down like a family secret. The designs shift, some become smaller, easier to conceal under kimono sleeves or behind the nape of the neck. Others grow wilder, more intricate, challenging anyone who dares to decode them. Fast forward to 1868, and the Meiji restoration is in full swing. Japan is turbocharging its image, desperate to look modern and Western for a parade of foreign diplomats. Tattoos, with all their mythic energy and rebellious edge, are suddenly the ultimate embarrassment. The government goes nuclear. Arezumi isn't just illegal now. It's shameful, an ugly relic of a savage past. Foreign visitors are appalled when they spot a tattooed working man at the docks. The Japanese elite, determined to impress the West, shove tattooing even further into the shadows. But here's the cosmic joke. As Japanese society tries to scrub Ilizumi from its collective skin, British and American sailors swarm the ports, begging local horishi for a slice of exotic oriental body art to take home. I'm hanging out in a Yokohama tattoo studio, and it's like the world's weirdest souvenir shop. The same tattoos being erased domestically are now prized overseas, preserved on the arms of sailors who'll flash them in London pubs and New York bars. The government's horror is the foreigner's fascination. If irony had an ink color, it would be running everywhere. Meanwhile, the tradition survives in the shadows. Horishi adapt, switching up their clientele and moving their studios deeper into labyrinthine neighborhoods. Some pass down the art only within their families, or to students they trust not to blab to the authorities. The Tibori method, hand-poked and painstaking, lives on, its rhythm as steady as ever. The symbolism, the designs, the tools are all preserved, like a secret recipe for defiance. Jumping ahead to the 20th century, the tattoo scene is now married to the Yakuza. Full-body suits, once badges of honor or spiritual protection, morph into veiled warnings, hidden beneath crisp business suits, only revealed in those rare, charged moments. Tattoos become weapons in the arsenal of intimidation, but the art itself is still there, pulsing with old meaning. Its pain, its pride, but the folkloric grace is gone, replaced by a hard-edged aura of danger. Even today, the echoes of all that stigma haven't faded. Modern Japan is obsessed with cleanliness, order, and harmony. If you want to swim at a public pool, hit the gym, or just relax at a hot spring, your ink might get you turned away. The association between tattoos and crime is so strong, even the most innocent designs get suspicious side-eye. I met a young artist in Tokyo, sleeves rolled up to show off a cascade of cherry blossoms and playful foxes. She shrugs and says, "People still stare." My grandma thinks I joined a gang. The fear lingers, a ghost on the surface of every tattooed arm. But here's the twist ending. Just when you think the story's over, a new generation is stepping up and asking, why are we ashamed of our own skin? Museums are mounting exhibitions of Edo period designs. Historians and art lovers are tracking down old masterworks, marveling at the technique and the symbolism. Young artists are reclaiming Irezumi, not as rebellion, but as heritage, an unbroken thread from mythic past to uncertain future. In a society built on layers of clothing, of meaning, of silence, tattoos remain the most honest thing Japan ever tried to bury. The ink tells stories that survived fire, shame, and exile. It's a reminder that what we try to suppress often ends up being the most enduring part of who we are. And speaking of things societies try to suppress, let's hop across continents and centuries. Imagine me, now crashing a Renaissance dinner party, elbowing through monks, scholars, and bored wives, while everyone pretends they're not obsessed with what's really going on behind closed doors. Of course, not all forbidden books were pretending to be scientific. Picture yourself gliding through a Renaissance salon, dodging powdered wigs, sidestepping a suspiciously tipsy cardinal, and clutching your press pass like it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Suddenly, someone slips you a slim, velvet-bound book. No anatomical diagrams, no long-winded sermons, just pure, distilled mischief. Welcome to the secret world of love manuals. The original How to Flirt Without Getting Excommunicated guides. Now, these weren't your church-approved. Marriage is for procreation. Snooze fests. No, these were half etiquette handbooks and half soft focus, romance Bibles, designed for the upstanding nobleman or lady who wanted to court disaster, without actually ending up in a confessional booth for the next week. If you think modern dating advice columns walk a fine line, the Renaissance manuals made it an art form. They were the original guides to sliding into the DMs, just with more lace and a whole lot more risk. They offered elaborate tips on everything from the subtlety of a glance to the calculated deployment of a dramatic sigh. Picture a ballroom, candlelight bouncing off gold brocade, and you supposedly discussing the weather while actually plotting your love life with the precision of a chess grandmaster. These books didn't just tell you how to court. They handed you scripts, sample dialogues for every occasion, bumping into a duchess in the rose garden, complimenting a lady's lute playing without making her chaperone suspicious, or navigating the treacherous waters of a masked ball where half the guests are pretending not to recognize each other. And then there were the letters. The epistolary romance. Think of it as the Renaissance version of a spicy text thread, only written with peacock feathers and a lot more metaphors about dying of longing. The big hits always starred the likes of Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiorella, whose fictional correspondence was supposed to demonstrate virtuous affection. But honestly, you could practically hear the bodices creaking and the gloves being ever so slowly peeled away. The virtuous. Love letters started out all, "Fair lady, my heart is thine," and, if you squinted, ended up sounding suspiciously like, "Meet me in the garden at midnight and bring the key." But why stop at letters? Some manuals even snuck in miniature poems and riddles, just enough to impress your local salon, but vague enough to get you out of trouble if a bishop walked in. Renaissance readers absolutely adored a double meaning, and these books delivered, wrapping scandal in silky rhymes and playful couplets. You wanted to sound cultured, but if the right person caught your eye across the ballroom, you could let your poem do the winking for you. And let's not ignore the grooming advice. One love manual solemnly advised men to keep their fingernails immaculate and their teeth sparkling, so as not to offend the lips of a lady when kissed. Another warned women to avoid onions before a romantic tete-a-tete, unless they wanted to clear the dance floor faster than a tax collector. These were practical tips, sure, but the subtext was as clear as Venetian glass. Seduction begins with soap. Of course, the real genius of these manuals was their ability to say everything while saying nothing. Physical intimacy was rarely described outright. Instead, it hummed between the lines. The tension built so thick You could slice it with a letter opener. Picture slow-burning drama unfolding across moonlit terraces, behind fluttering fans, and through veils so sheer they might as well have been invitations. For young nobles trapped in arranged marriages and suffocating under the church's moral gaze, these books were clandestine escape hatches. Legally, you could own them. Understanding them? That was a whole different game. While priests railed against sin and scholars split hairs over virtue, some Renaissance readers were slipping ancient poetry under their pillows. And not just any poetry. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the original Art of Love, manual, was basically the 50 Shades of Latin verse. Officially, it was a Roman classic. Unofficially, it was a step-by-step guide to seduction. How to catch someone's eye at the theater. How to fake jealousy just enough to keep things interesting. And how to write a love letter that would get you invited to the next masked ball. It was witty, clever, and, by church standards, completely scandalous. Naturally, it was a runaway bestseller. Copies of Ovid started popping up everywhere, hidden behind Bibles or disguised with blank covers. You'd find handwritten notes in the margins. Try this at Carnival, or worked on Cecilia, who said Latin was just for sleep stories, not these guys. Then there was Apuleius's, the Golden Ass, a wild ride of transformation, magic, and, yes, the occasional donkey with questionable boundaries. It passed itself off as a spiritual allegory. But make no mistake, it was mythology with a wink and a nudge, and enough steamy subplots to keep any private library lively. But why stick to the classics? Renaissance Italy had a serious thing for the exotic, and translations of Greek and Arabic love poetry started circulating among the elite. These weren't sold out in the open, but if you knew the right bookseller and flashed a little gold, you might find yourself holding a hand-copied page from the Perfumed Garden, a text that made even the most seasoned bishop sweat. Bookshops officially stopped theology and grammar, but the right password, a conspiratorial wink, and a few coins could get you into the secret medical curiosities section, where the only thing getting cured was boredom. The church, naturally, was not amused. To them, every seductive verse and every clever double entendre was a mortal threat to the soul. But for booksellers, it was all just good business. Some nobles even commissioned illuminated manuscripts of these works, complete with gold leaf, cherubs, and, let's be honest, illustrations that would have made those cherubs blush all the way to the clouds. These weren't just books. They were status symbols, passed around at salons, quoted at masquerades, and occasionally scolded by bishops who pretended not to recognize them. Everyone maintained the polite fiction that they were reading for the Latin practice, but nobody was fooled. The real story was written between the lines, whispered behind fans, and giggled about behind closed doors. Still, the Renaissance was no paradise for free expression. The Inquisition was always lurking, and in Italy you could never be too careful. By the middle of the 1500s, the Catholic Church decided it was time to take things up a notch. If there was a book that could possibly lead you astray, from Protestant theologies to astrology handbooks to anything that made you giggle, it went on the hit list. Enter the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the ultimate do-not-read list, dropped by Pope Paul IV in 1559. If you've ever seen a parent try to hide their liquor cabinet by locking it, you know how well this worked. The list was a greatest hits of temptation and intellectual rebellion. Ovid, banned. Boccaccio's Decameron, banned. Erasmus, with even a whiff of independent thought, double banned, just for good measure. The church wasn't content to just save souls. They wanted to scrub the entire cultural bloodstream clean of anything spicy, witty, or remotely entertaining. Owning a forbidden book became a high-stakes game. Printers, merchants, and nobles caught with a naughty volume faced public penance, home raids, and even a stint in the local jail. The number of scholars called in to explain why the art of love was cozied up between Aristotle and Aquinas. Let's just say the line at the confessional got pretty long. But here's the thing about banning books. It only makes them more irresistible. Underground markets flourished. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel got clever. They'd produce one clean edition for public sale, and another, uncut, unfiltered, and sometimes with a fake title page for their favorite clients. One notorious copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Now that's what I call a plot twist. Private libraries evolved into fortresses of subversion, complete with secret compartments, faux bindings, and mirrored cabinets. It was a mix of espionage and erotica. A truly impressive bookshelf didn't just say, "I fear God," it said, "I fear God, but I also appreciate a well-placed innuendo." Women, by the way, were the unsung heroes of this literary underground. Considered less of a threat by the authorities, they became expert couriers, borrowing, copying, and circulating forbidden works under the pretense of devotional reading. One nun in Naples, legend has it, kept a copy of The Perfumed Garden tucked behind her Lives of the Saints. Now that's multitasking. So, sure, censorship reigned in public. But in private, Renaissance readers just learned to turn the page with a little more caution and a lot more anticipation. If you thought the salons and libraries were spicy, just wait until you peek inside the convent walls. Behind convent walls, away from the judgmental eyes of society and the ever-looming index of forbidden books, Renaissance nuns had access to their own libraries, and some of them were anything but holy. Let's see what holy sisters were really reading after lights out. Let's slip behind the convent walls for a moment. No, not for a Dan Brown plot twist or a Gregorian chant, but for one of the Renaissance's juiciest secrets, the underground world of forbidden books. Picture me, your time-traveling party reporter, ducking into a cloister after midnight, clutching a quill like a backstage pass. On the surface, convents were temples of virtue and candle-lit devotion. But if you look closer, past all the pious iconography, you'd find something far spicier than a saint's biography. These places were absolutely packed with literacy, curiosity, and, let's be honest, a suppressed longing that could have powered Florence's streetlights for a year. A lot of these nuns hadn't exactly chosen the veil by inspiration. Some were sent here because their families couldn't afford the marriage market. Others had opinions, a little too bold for dinner with the in-laws. So, imagine a whole generation of women, brilliant, forcibly celibate, and bored enough to memorize the Psalms backward. Now, drop them into a library. You're thinking dusty tomes and devotional poetry, right? Well, sure, those were there. But if you started poking around the margins, you'd notice some very enthusiastic underlining. some suspiciously emotional commentary, and, my personal favorite, love poems copied out by hand and disguised as prayer notes. Take the case of the Ferrara nun who was caught translating Ovid's Amores into everyday Italian. Just for educational purposes, she claimed. Sure, and I only went to that secret speakeasy in Edo to research rice wine, right? Meanwhile, other sisters penned their own verses. They wrote in code, laced with longing, bittersweet, and drenched in the kind of melancholy that makes you want to sigh dramatically into your habit. Some scholars now believe that many of the most passionate Renaissance sonnets, supposedly written by mysterious noblewomen, were actually the midnight projects of cloistered nuns, using poetry as their secret portal to a world of romance they'd never touch but could still imagine. And the forbidden fruit didn't stop at poetry. Some convent libraries boasted anatomical treatises, supposedly for nursing the sick. Medical knowledge, they'd say, while blushing behind their wimples. But anatomy books in the Renaissance? Let's just say, they were rarely limited to the circulatory system. One especially creative abbess in Florence even tried to keep her convent's illustrated anatomy manual by arguing it would help the younger nuns understand temptation. That's some next-level syllabus design. Of course, the Church didn't just let these pages circulate unchecked. But literacy was a double-edged sword. Once you can read, you can imagine. And once you can imagine, you might get ideas, dangerous, subversive ones. So forbidden texts found their own back-alley routes. Margins filled with secret codes, pages slipped between prayer books, entire passages memorized and then recited in candlelit whispers. The scent of ink and vellum in those silent libraries could be more intoxicating than the incense wafting from the altar. Picture the quiet after evening prayers. The chapel is hushed. Shadows stretch across the stone floor, and somewhere a young nun lights a stubby candle. She opens not a psalter, but a battered book filled with poems or stolen stories from a world just out of reach. Sometimes the most dangerous contraband wasn't about lust. It was about freedom, the chance to imagine, even if you could never act. But let's step outside the convent for a second. Not every forbidden book was hidden behind monastery doors or chained to a lectern. Some were tucked in aprons, buried under floorboards, or simply whispered from memory in the rowdy chaos of a back-alley book market. Here, the star attractions weren't printed by reputable presses or debated at salons. These were the magical texts. Grimoire manuscripts, herb manuals, and charm books passed from midwife to midwife, from wise woman to apprentice. No one called themselves a witch, but everyone else definitely did. For women especially, love was a kind of power, the only kind that was both coveted and feared. That's why love spells were the bestseller in this shadowy world of secret books. Renaissance charm books would teach you how to snag a spouse, cause obsession, or reignite a marriage gone stale. The ingredients. Sometimes a strand of hair, a goblet of wine, and a whispered name beneath the full moon. Not exactly the Summa Theologica. This was folk science at its saltiest. Did it work? Well, as with most modern dating apps, the results were mixed, but the hope was half the magic. One spellbook from southern Italy, now legendary, included a ritual for keeping your lover faithful. Sew a pinch of dried basil into his doublet. Whisper his name 3 times. Sprinkle rose water on his pillow. And if he dreams of you, the spell is working. If he doesn't, no worries. There's always something stronger in the next chapter. Renaissance aphrodisiac recipes were a wild blend of botanical wisdom and medieval optimism. Cinnamon, anise, ground oysters, mandrake root, sometimes genuinely effective, sometimes more likely to land you in the 100's version of urgent care. I found one apothecary's guide that breezily suggested honey, wine, and powdered stag antler to awaken the fires of Venus. They forgot to mention the side effect, nosebleeds worthy of a horror movie. It wasn't just the men who were curious. Women were the main stewards and readers of these magical texts. The recipes and rituals were handed down like family heirlooms, especially in rural villages where the priest only came around for major holidays and midwives handled everything else, from childbirth to heartbreak. But possessing these books was a gamble. The Inquisition did not have a sense of humor about women with too much knowledge, and a love spell was basically a witch trial waiting to happen. So pages were disguised as herbal remedies, hidden in recipe books, or, if things got dicey, burned before the bishop could come knocking. You could be an herbalist on Monday and a heretic by Thursday, depending on who peeked inside your kitchen cupboard. And then, the Renaissance's version of the internet drop, the printing press. Suddenly, books weren't precious, hand-written treasures for the elite. They were mass-produced, easier to get, and, most importantly, easier to hide. Sure, Gutenberg started with Bibles, but it didn't take long for printers to realize the real money was in desire. Venice became the Las Vegas of this secret publishing revolution. The city offered the perfect recipe: indulgent wealth, loose censors, and a solid appetite for vice. Behind the window displays of religious tracts, printers churned out slim, privately circulated volumes that didn't bother with euphemism or double meaning. They weren't pretending to be anatomy manuals or devotional poetry. These books were explicit, illustrated, and about as subtle as a flash mob in St. Mark's Square. The most notorious of the bunch was called I Modi, or The Positions. Created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, with racy illustrations by Giulio Romano, it featured 16 scenes of what we'll politely call Renaissance intimacy. Each engraving came paired with verses from Pietro Aretino, whose pen was as sharp as his sense of mischief. The church, predictably, was not thrilled. I Modi was banned, plates seized, copies destroyed, and Raimondi thrown in jail. But the cat, or should I say, the Kama Sutra, was already out of the bag. The printing press had unleashed a whole new world of underground erotica. Secret presses popped up across Europe, printing everything from love poetry to outright smut. These weren't cheap mass-market paperbacks. They were pricey, often custom commissioned for wealthy patrons who wanted something a little more provocative than the latest history of Rome. Some clients even ordered bespoke stories tailored to their own fantasies. Think of it as Renaissance fan fiction, but with a lot more velvet. Printers became masters of disguise. They'd add fake title pages, claim the book was published in Constantinople, or fill the text with Latin phrases to make it look like a harmless philosophy treatise. On the outside, a book might look like a dictionary or a prayer book, but inside, well, Let's just say the illustrations made your average anatomy text look like a children's coloring book. Nobles would lock these volumes up in cabinets with special keys, or commission bindings that blended perfectly with the family Bibles. The printing press didn't just democratize knowledge. It made lust as portable as a pocket prayer. And every time a new title hit the underground market, Renaissance readers got a little closer to something truly radical. Pleasure without permission. By the end of the era, the lines between education, entertainment, and seduction were so blurred, they might as well have been painted with wine. What started as curiosity about the human body or religious devotion ended up as a secret bookshelf of longing. That bookshelf crossed every boundary, gender, class, even religion. For the church, these books looked like moral decay. For scholars, they were experiments in the limits of knowledge. But for the people who actually read them, noble women, students, nuns, merchants, they weren't about sin or science. They were about power. Not the kind you win in a sword fight or at a council meeting, but the quiet, subversive power that starts with a scribbled margin in a book. In a world where women's bodies were regulated, their voices muffled, and their desires shamed, these secret texts became a lifeline, a script where love wasn't arranged, where pleasure was named, and where curiosity didn't have to be confessed in Latin. A love spell hidden in a recipe book, a censored sonnet copied by hand, a banned poem read by candlelight, each was a rebellion in disguise. And let's not leave out the men. For all the public sermons and chest thumping about virtue, plenty of philosophers kept a copy of The Golden Ass under their robes. Priests who thundered against lust from the pulpit sometimes had their own favorite passages from Ovid, tucked away for private reading. Human nature has always specialized in double standards. The forbidden bookshelf wasn't just the Renaissance party trick. It was a mirror held up to a world in flux. The printing press had blown open the doors. Literacy was spreading fast. Ideas were getting too slippery to contain. And once people realized books could spark desire, real, private, sometimes scandalous desire, there was no turning back. Most of those books didn't survive the centuries. They were burned, misfiled, or hidden so well even the librarians forgot about them. But a few made it through. Today, they sit in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile as autumn leaves, still humming with secrets whispered across centuries. Because the Renaissance wasn't just about painting ceilings and inventing the scientific method. It was about the rebirth of longing, the democratization of desire, and the dangerous thrill of reading something that could change the way you see yourself and the world forever. The forbidden books tell us everything. The marble statues never could. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of a candle being lit, a page turning, and a heart racing in the dark.